Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our meeting tonight on the geopolitics of energy. We are Cambridge for Europe, which is a local branch of the European Movement UK. My name is Paul Brown and I'm chair. I've just got a few notices before I hand over to Camilla, who will be chairing this meeting, and she will introduce our two speakers for the evening. European Movement UK is a national movement campaigning for closer links between the UK and the EU, and ultimately for the UK to rejoin the EU. But currently, it has a campaign called One Earth, One Team, which is actually campaigning for a closer cooperation between the UK and the EU on environmental matters, on green transition, on other issues surrounding protecting the environment, water, etc. So if you'd like to find out more about that campaign, you can go to the website and there's a QR code there which you can scan. I'll leave that up for a minute or two, but then I'll also add the link in our chat. Couple of housekeeping notices. We'll start with a couple of short presentations by each of the speaker, and then we'll open it up to a question and answer with the audience. Please put your questions in the chat, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and prefix it with question, and then write your question, and then we will read that out for the panel. You've been muted. Please don't, you won't be able to unmute unless we allow you to. Also, if you could leave your videos off, it can help with making sure that we keep the bandwidth. But, you know, it's up to you. We are recording this and we'll make the recording available later. So just please be aware of that too. And I think with that, I'll hand over to Camilla.
Thank you, Paul. So good evening, everyone, and warm welcome. So my name is Camilla Cucinotta, and I'm a committee member of Cambridge for Europe. And my role tonight is to guide the discussion and just keep us on track. I'll be chairing the session and helping make sure we get the most of our wonderful speakers and from your questions too. Just a brief reminder, please do keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. I know we've all had years of Zoom by now, but somehow kettles and dogs barking still manage to sneak in. Tonight, we're focusing on Russia's invasion on Ukraine and how this has reshaped not just geopolitics, but the energy map of Europe and beyond. We've seen skyrocketing energy prices as strategics crumble to reduce reliance on Russian fossil fuels and a renewed, I'd say, urgency to accelerate the clean energy transition. And so all of this raises big questions, such as how can Europe move forward in ways that are realistic, politically viable and fair, and what roles should renewable energy efficiency and decentralized system play in strengthening democratic resilience. To unpack this question, we have two exceptional speakers, Svitlana Romanko. Svitlana is a Ukrainian climate activist, environmental lawyer, and the founder of Razom We Stand. She is a leading advocate for ending fossil fuel dependency and championing fossil fuel-free response to war and climate breakdown as a pathway to peace, democracy, and climate justice. And we also have Lisa Fischer, Associate Director for Energy Transition at ER3G, which is a leading global climate think tank. She's a specialist in the energy transition with extensive experience advising the UK government and European institutions. And Lisa brings a strong geopolitical perspective to energy policies, focusing on how the UK and EU can develop secure, clean, and resilient energy system in an increasingly uncertain world. I'd say we'll begin with Lisa, followed by Svitlana, each presenting for around 10 minutes. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and I'm going to try and share my slides. In the meantime, obviously, first, thank you very much for the invitation, but when you first approached me to talk about the geopolitics of the energy transition in what is definitely a very complicated environment, I was like, what should I be focusing on? One moment. And I've decided to really focus on where there's agency for us, where there is, given we're in such a messy environment, where can we look at the energy transition actually as a way of moving us from stalemate to a way forward, also on geopolitics. So just kicking us off, I'm just very briefly going to say a bit about who we are at ECG, give you a bit of context, because I know you're not necessarily energy experts, on where the energy transition needs to go globally, and then look at how the energy transition and geopolitics intersect, and obviously just picking out a few big trends here before looking at where I see actually the scope for agency. And actually, when preparing this, I thought actually the scope for agency isn't that little, and I'm sure Svitlana will come to a lot of that as well, with much more detail and focus on Russian and European relations. Moving on, so ECG, we are a climate think tank, not for profit. Our focus is very much on situating climate within those broader societal, economic, and political topics, such as geopolitics or energy security, energy poverty as well, in particular in the UK, is an important issue for us. And we work in the UK, the EU, and globally. But now getting really to the meat of it, just as a bit of sort of context, the energy transition is a huge transformation of our energy system. Where we want to go is a highly flexible, interconnected, clean energy system where power takes the lion's share as an energy carrier. Now, lots of people will not like this. There's lots of reasons for many parts of the economy not to be supporting this, but there's also lots of people who will win from this and profit from such a transition. But we're really in the midst of it. So we're really in a world now where renewables have taken off, and they are threatening some of the incumbent business models. And this is why it's getting so messy and hard to understand where the trends are. And that's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this slide. Just kind of, again, as orientation, the International Energy Agency every year does its World Energy Outlook, and they do a scenario that's called a net zero scenario. So this is about what do we need to do in the energy sector to stay on track for the Paris goals. And giving you a bit of a flavor here, by 2030, 35, that would mean our oil consumption wouldn't need to have peaked globally. Our gas consumption would need to have plateaued. Half of the cars on the roads would be electric. By 2040, the G7 actually a bit earlier, and the G20 then by 2040, we would no longer be using unabated fossil fuels in the power systems, and hardly any fossil fuels, but those that we use would be used with abatement technologies like carbon capture. And by 2050, more than 50% of industrial processes would be electrified. And actually overall, and this is also one of the silver linings really, our energy system would be 20 to 30% more efficient, because if we electrify, if we invest in building insulation and more efficient processes, we actually need much less energy, which is also why very often when fossil fuel industry talks about are we making very little progress, it's not true, because if we are at the same time replacing fossil fuels with renewables and we're electrifying the economy, we're actually building a much, much more efficient energy system. So this is where we need to get to. Where are we? Just again, to give you a flavor, we've gone through successive crises. We had the COVID economic collapse that has also really impacted the fossil industry. Prices collapsed, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine brought record profits back to the industry, and it put energy affordability on many countries' agenda. In some places, that meant actually it aligned with what we want to do on the energy transition, because they understood investing in renewables helps independence, helps bringing costs down, helps reducing the subsidy load. But in other countries, it kind of displaced the focus on the energy transition. But yeah, again, just to give you an example, I think the EU originally invested a lot in the clean energy and managed to replace about 15% of Russian gas just through renewables and heat pumps in a couple of years' time. But we're now in a slightly different moment of time now, a few years into the war, and priorities are shifting. We will get back to that. So all in all, we're moving very fast, but by no means fast enough. No country, for example, has tried running on a basically 100% variable renewables system for longer than 6 days. Like some countries have run on renewables, but they have a lot of geothermal and hydropower. They're very different. Not every country has those. Most countries don't have those in huge abundance. And so Portugal is one of the few countries that actually managed to run a system on largely solar and wind and a little bit of hydropower for a longer amount of time. So in terms of getting to fossil-free power systems, we still have a very long way to go, even though we've made huge progress. Electric vehicle and heat pump sales are absolutely skyrocketing, but from a low base. And they are definitely facing system barriers now in terms of networks, network build out, and also in terms of incumbent pushback. If you look at the European discussion on car manufacturing goals around electric vehicles in Germany, where I'm from, originally, the automotive industry is still fighting to the last of their teeth against any targets on electric vehicles. So we've come a very long way, and sort of the technologies the energy transition relies on are definitely taking more and more market share, but we are not quite fully transforming the system yet. Now, looking really at the geopolitics, and as I said, I can only pick out some of what I think are the big trends and dynamics at the moment for us to understand when it comes to the energy transition. I picked out 3 headwinds and later 3 tailwinds. I think one of the key pieces that when we discuss the energy transition with diplomats and decision makers is what's on many people's mind is China's supply chain dominance. China dominates critical mineral supply and refining for key energy transition materials. It also dominates manufacturing for solar, batteries, and wind. And that tiny little graph at the bottom left, you don't necessarily need to understand in detail, but the red bar is the first supplier on each of these, in most cases China. And so you can see it's a very concentrated market. And that obviously is a concern for most countries, even though it is very, very different to import solar panels than it is to import oil and gas, because you don't burn solar panels and then have to import them again, right? That's what you do with oil and gas, and so your dependence is much more acute. Yet there's a whole discussion behind that around what's the economic opportunity then for all other countries if China is dominating this. Where does the growth go and who profits from this? There is the Trump's drill baby drill rhetoric is certainly settling into investor perception. Oil and gas have their confidence back, and that is to some extent changing what investors are thinking they might be doing over the next few years. And we're seeing some investment trends changing, but again, I don't think it's a full change in direction yet. And I did want to emphasize that the market environment is still very, very fragile for oil and gas. There's a lot of talk of confidence at the moment, but when you look at the prices, they're actually quite low. For much of the US industry, it's below their break-even cost. They're all paring down on staff costs, on operational expenditure, and we have a looming oil and gas oversupply. So it is actually still a very fragile industry despite this talk of confidence. And then a point that, yeah, I did want to highlight, we will talk in much more detail about Russia and Russia's war on Ukraine, which is the absolute priority. But it is also really important, I think, to understand that Russia, if we want to go all the way in the energy transition, we need to understand what role Russia is playing. And Russia is a key fossil fuel, not only producer, but 12% of global gas demand is in Russia. It's growing really fast because obviously they're struggling to export a lot of their gas. They're key to Arctic science and management. They will be a very big beneficiary of an ice-free Arctic because they can ship their gas then through the Arctic. So this is really an area where cooperation is impossible. But we also don't know how it will be hard to solve the problem if we don't think about Russia and situating Russia. In terms of geopolitical tailwinds, I think one of the key ones is that I think most countries have understood that slowing down on the energy transition, or even not progressing fast enough, would mean ceding more power to the most autocratic countries out there. The data is quite clear that continued fossil fuel consumption would make countries more vulnerable to the leverage by Middle East and Russia, because they are the countries that have the biggest oil and gas fields, the cheapest production costs. They will stay in the market for longest. And so the market will over time concentrate. And then the big question is, how do importers respond? Do they respond by keeping countries like the UK and Norway in the market slightly artificially, even though they're not very competitive? Or do they respond by really radically cutting down their own oil and gas consumption? Second, I've already alluded to this point, but market power of the clean economy is really growing. Investment in electrotech is now twice that of fossil investment. That's some new data from think tank Amber. I could throw you lots of other statistics on this. Renewables are dominating capacity additions on global electricity supply these days. So this is the growth market when it comes to energy. It is not fossil fuels. And energy transition is key to energy security. Earlier this year, the IEA, and so the International Energy Agency, and the UK brought countries together in London to talk about energy security, and all but the US were saying, well, we need to accelerate the energy transition. That this is our way to energy security. That's homegrown energy. It doesn't mean it doesn't come without challenges, but it gives us much more agency. And we all know that price volatility, especially on oil and gas, is here to stay because of what I was saying. We're now in an oversupply market. People are just misguessing what the future is. So we will see a lot of up and down. And that's a macroeconomic problem for many fossil fuel importers. And that's also why we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years only some unexpected leaders stepping up. So, for example, Pakistan has embarked on a ground solar strategy to reduce its gas import reliance. Ethiopia is going big on electric vehicles because they can't afford to send all their foreign reserves or put all their foreign reserves just into oil imports. So things are really changing here, which I think is really interesting to observe. I want to just quickly conclude on what this does all mean for how we move forward. There's a couple of pieces, I think, where for those of us who think about the energy transition, we can only sort of watch and adapt. We don't have much agency over. I think the China-Russia relationship is critical. Currently, China really does not want to over rely on Russian energy imports, which is a real issue for Russia, and because it puts a ceiling on their export markets. But if ever China decided to change their position on this would be a real issue, and it would strengthen Russia's hand vis-a-vis Europe and Ukraine in particular. Trade wars, obviously an agenda of the last couple of years, in particular pushed by Trump. We are seeing actually that in many places critical raw materials are exempt from trade wars, not only because they are significant for the energy transition, but also because the defense industry needs pretty much the same critical minerals as the energy transition. Yet some countries want to reshore quite a lot, start mining at home, refine at home, put more manufacturing at home, and that does drive the cost of the energy transition up. It also means often better human rights and environmental standards, which is a good thing, but it is a dynamic that is quite hard to understand and unpick. But there are 3 pieces that I really want to conclude on, which is where energy transition and energy cooperation can shape geopolitics positively from my point of view. One is leveraging the power of demand. I think importers can really learn from what happened over the last few years following the Russian invasion and prepare collectively for the next crisis that will come. They can work together on setting standards, on shaping global oil and gas markets. They can work together on supporting each other to accelerate the transition away from oil and gas. There's huge potential in there for the EU, for Korea, for China, for India, Pakistan. There's a huge group of countries that could be working together. There's a critical role for safeguarding independent advice and multilateral institutions. The COP regime is under pressure. The International Energy Agency is under pressure from their membership, in particular the US. Some of this can be replaced through plurilateral and bilateral cooperation. But for example, the International Energy Agency and its data power is irreplaceable in terms of what we need for global energy cooperation. So really investing in that as an anchor for global cooperation is critical. And then finally, energy cooperation needs to ensure that the benefits of the transition really spread beyond China and OECD. Still, most of the renewables investment happen in China and OECD countries, and most of the energy finance flows to those countries. So we really need to work together to ensure this is a story that benefits the globe much more evenly than it currently does. And I think that will fundamentally change the geopolitics of the energy transition as well. I'll finish here. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Lisa. I think that was a really, really great, insightful perspective. Before we open up to questions, I would sort of like leave it to Svitlana.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm happy to present on the fossil fuel interconnection to the authoritarianism and to the Russian invasion in Ukraine that has happened back in early 2022. But first, I would like to start from introducing the organization. I currently established and helped developed to coordinate the global coalition of almost 900 organizations from 60 countries of the world, and to ban Russian fossil fuels and immediately end all investments into Russian oil and gas companies and rebuild Ukraine on clean energy, showcasing the possibility of the immediate fossil fuel phase out and global energy transition. So we are Ukrainian-based, but also active in Europe and international in the high-impact climate advocacy group calling for what I just said. And our mission is to end fossil fuel war and conflicts and climate chaos and drive the clean energy revolution in Ukraine and globally. And we strive for a peaceful and just world with renewable, affordable, and secure energy systems that serve all people. Before going to a specific of the presentation of European dependency on Russian gas, which I will have a few slides for you, I would like to emphasize the key points regarding the invasion and the role the fossil fuel companies played in that invasion and spike in prices and the cost of energy, and actually very much connected to cost of living and general fall of democratic societies that we have witnessed through a chain of the elections that had happened across the world in more than 160 countries in the past year. To start with, the oil and gas revenues provide autocratic regimes like Russia with immense financial resources, because just to bring the point here, 80% of overall Russian oil and gas reserves are being concentrated in the Arctic, which Lisa also mentioned today. And Russia has huge access to the deposits, including energy transition minerals, not just fossil fuels like oil and gas. And this allows them to consolidate power domestically and exert geopolitical influence and control over the Western countries. As well, Russia's economy is still heavily dependent on hydrocarbon exports, which constitute around 60% of its exports and 30% of the federal budget revenues even now. And since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has earned more than 931 billion from fossil fuel exports. So we can see that this toll is reaching to 1 trillion, which is exactly the amount that Russian aggression towards Ukraine has brought the destruction of our country and our cities. The estimate cost of rebuilding is now around $1 trillion of US dollars. And to rebuild on the energy system, we will perhaps need around 200 billions just immediately to cover the basic needs to restore those 13 gigawatts that have been largely destroyed, including through the coal power plants that used to to be the 60% of energy mix at different years. So Russia's fossil fuel export revenues empowers the state to fund military expansion, to strengthen the military buildup, which is causing more and more emissions, because no secret that the emissions that have been released during Russia's war in Ukraine, they amounted that a size of emissions of one of few European countries just per year, which is, of course, that's a really bad side of and geopolitical influence when the world, especially the EU, was trying to cut the emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The war unleashes not just a desperate thirst in a military buildup and the spending the huge of public money to the military infrastructure and weapons instead of funding the energy for the most vulnerable population. But what we see is just currently we are all under the threat of this militarization, including for the climate policies, and actually to continue this aggressive foreign policies that Russia used to extend over other countries without accountability to citizens is weakening democratic governance both domestically and abroad, and such petrostates are statistically more prone to conflict and authoritarianism. And as being working with Russia in the past, I can definitely tell that they don't aim for any cutting of greenhouse gas emissions, and they build their overall strategies just on fossil fuels, on oil and gas. But now they are not leading the market, and our main goal as an organization of the civil society and the campaign we ran towards Russian fossil fuel profits was to eliminate their market share, to enable the draining the financial flows that used to feed the war economy. And it has been successful, as the UK government calculated so far. The altogether effort was able to effectively cut almost $500 billion. It is about $500 billion of dollars in financial profits to Russia, which we consider a good result. But as we can also see, regrettably, it won't help us to end the war and the conditions that would help Ukraine thrive. So the more work it needs to be done towards shaping the anti-fossil fuel policies in Europe and more broadly. And fossil fuel industries place a focus on keeping profits maximized, as we've just seen in the very beginning of a full-scale invasion, where the oil prices went insane in the few next months, as we know that the price of oil defines the sympathy of the voters in many countries. And if the price of oil or gasoline gets slightly more expensive, so you should expect a civil unrest, basically, as it happened to the many countries of the global south, including Ecuador, for example. When the cost of petrol is rising, there is a civic unrest, and there are lots of protests against those governmental policies if they are really good, really renewable energy oriented, but if they don't profit those who are on the ground, if they are socially unacceptable, not licensed. So our goal with the time being is to create the policies which would be more favorable for the population needs and will account for cost of living crisis, and then will let significantly and exponentially decrease the price of consuming energy and actually electricity for the citizens directly. And it currently has been a huge problem inside of the Europe and beyond, because Europe, as we know, has the highest kilowatt per hour electricity price, and many productions and manufacturers are moving their companies to the other countries where the electricity is much cheaper, and the government subsidizes the clean energy as well, including to Latin America, and we will see more of this, which of course will weaken the economy of the European continent. And actually, just for going back to the fossil fuel industries, so this has historically led to the fossil fuel industry lobbying and supporting violent dictatorships, because in many countries, not just Russia, when we go beyond Russia, there are also 52 other dictatorships in the world with who build their wealth and state wealth on oil mainly. There are countries that 90% funded by the oil sales, and this is a huge problem which is not going to be solved easily, even in a scale of this confrontation between the countries of so-called global north and global south. Russia widely spreads disinformation about clean energy alternatives as free energy sources, wind and solar, that this would undermine the business model of the fossil fuel companies, which we agree, but we also been seeing that the fossil fuel companies try to green their portfolios, and they simply purchase very small green businesses and accumulate the green capacities under their overall business umbrella, which we don't yet know good or bad until this creates another state monopoly and another private owned monopoly, and will be lobbying basically governments and policies. And energy security, true energy security, can only occur when a nation is no longer reliant on foreign provision of energy sources. And for many nations, this means true security can only come from nationally created renewable energy systems, as it's only happening across Europe. But the price for gas is still an issue, because the gas is largely used for heating houses, and Europe will have to switch to more affordable but also greener ways to heat their homes to be able to effectively cut the dependency on Russian gas and deprive Russia only premium gas markets. And actually added benefits are that clean energy independence redirects capital flows inward and creates jobs, grows economies, and adds to economic growth as well. What should Europe and the US do in the perspective, in the longer and short-term perspective? So the first is just they need to fully ban all support for Russian fossil fuel exports, and LNG, which I'm going to provide you with a few key points just in a second, is becoming a huge problem, because in the world, LNG exporters are not that many. They are mainly the US and also Russia, as they used to be, and a few MENA countries in the Middle East, which creates a more and more dependency on the gas. And I disagree that gas is a transition fuel, and many of us disagree because it's still a fossil gas. And a fully ban all support for Russian fossil fuel exports, including insurance services or shipping LNG gas or oil, and especially by the European companies. I will just name a few while we speak about the fossil fuel industry. Total Energies, who are still supplying Russian origin LNG to European markets, and also CP, which is the US-based company that effectively consumes Scottish state subsidies to run their business, and they don't even pay taxes to Scotland. And we are trying to campaign to stop them of being active in carrying Russian LNG to Europe, and that's been partly successful. We've been able to deprive them around 6 million of Scottish government subsidies in the past, but they still remain an actors on that market. And Total Energies is, we know that it's a company that was one of the Novatek shareholders, and with the sanctioning of Arctic LNG 2, which we also helped happen, especially by the US former government, former administration, we've seen 12 billion of euros being pulled out of funding the Arctic LNG 2 project, which is going to be huge if built, and it will release about 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, which will be a good addition to climate collapse we are living through right now. And also SLB, another American firm who still supplies oil and gas infrastructure to repair the refineries that being hit by Ukrainian drones. This is, of course, more work to do on that. And lastly, we need to ensure that Russian gas pipelines, including Nord Stream 2, are not rebuilt to bring Russian LNG gas back to Europe. And Germany has yet to take steps to dismantle Nord Stream 2 in general. Just speaking about this, I will, if we have just 2 more minutes, I will just share some visuals with you, which will help you to understand this problem a bit more on a deeper level, and then we conclude, and hopefully we will be happy to take some questions. If we do, just let me please share the screen quickly. Yeah. So here the shocking figures quite well illustrate of how much profit, as I just mentioned, Europe brought to Russia directly, at the same time providing support for Ukraine and Ukrainian rebuilding, which is much less than the sums that they paid for Russian fossil fuels. And if we can see that how EU payments for Russian fossil fuels decline, so we can see this is quite a significant amount, but it doesn't mean that's been very effective. It just means that Europe was really, really addicted to Russian gas specifically and to oil, and Europe is still buying oil in spite of the oil ban. But mostly in the form of refined oil from Turkey and from from Turkey and India to some extent. And the EU still remains the largest importer of Russian fossil fuels, as it's been proven by data. And as I said, top EU gas suppliers. So EU can't diversify much. The only way to become energy independent is to expand on renewables even more effectively, as Repower EU, the plans they built, which I will touch upon just briefly. Right now, you can see that Europe just changing one gas dependency for another and reducing the consumption of gas is a key for the energy success in Europe. So these are the major gas pipelines. There were 4 of them, and that's only one currently in operation through the Turkey, and we work to cut this operation as well, but it's not so easy, as you know, because generally this supply has been run since the beginning of the full-scale invasion uninterrupted. And this is about LNG carriers, because it is quite specific in how Russia delivers this LNG gas, as they only the country in the world who has 15 icebreaker tankers to carry Russian gas. And if we deprive those tankers of insurance, and 80% of those tankers are being insured in the UK and the countries of Europe, if we stop insuring services for them, we'll be able to earn this physical delivery of the LNG gas. And this is what we demand on Russian gas. And I have to say that this demand has been quite effective, because just in 19th sanction package, just recently adopted, Europe has shifted the terms of fully ban Russian gas for 1 year, which is not bad. Now the Repower EU strategy needs to be adjusted, but it's still, we insist it has to, and it's economically viable to do it much sooner. So we need to work with the European Commission to make this happen. And lastly, this is a way how the ordinary legislative process is built within the EU. And so we hope to get a long-term legislation in the form of Repower EU strategy, which not only diversifies Europe of the gas consumption, but also allows hundreds of billions of investments into renewable energies. And this is how the sanctions are generally built. So I will stop sharing, and we'll conclude that while banning Russian fossil fuels from the market is quite a temporary but imagined measures to help Ukraine to end the war on the better conditions that has been largely anticipated, but at the same time, building the energy independence across European continent remains a very hard but highly desirable task that needs to be led by Ukraine as the largest country in Europe, as with a lot of reserves. of a different kind, including energy transition minerals. But this is only possible when Ukraine sets ourselves free from Russian aggression. Thank you.
Many thanks, Svitlana. I think that was a really great. You just explained like with such clarity and in depth, and it was a really thorough and interesting perspective. I would now open up the floor to question, and I would start by reading, I'd say maybe the first 2 questions, and then I'll give you time maybe to reply. I'd say maybe 1-2 minute each, Svitlana and Lisa, and then we can probably just continue reading them aloud. So first question is from Robert. I understand that Ukraine is learning how to rapidly switch to renewables as a result of what Russia is doing. What can other countries learn from Ukraine's amazing skills? Second question is from Germana. The UK climate minister yesterday highlighted the role of cooperation with US and Ukraine on nuclear power. What is your view on this? And I will start with this first 2 questions, and we can move to the next ones if you both agree.
I can quickly answer the first one on Ukraine. So the paramount is removing barriers, bureaucratic barriers to expand renewables, to let investors in the country, to create secure conditions for those investors, even during the wartime, to being able to build effective public-private partnerships. Because as Ukrainian economy has been run by local businesses mainly and private businesses, it's expected that 60% of the country's economy will be rebuilt by the private businesses, because they are main driving force for taxation, for everything, for activities, for people's jobs. And this is crucial, how we get those renewable energy deployment enabled on a state level. This, I would say, when state permits should not take a few years. They have to become immediate. And it is the same problem for Europe. So basically removing bureaucratic barriers to expand renewables will bring the benefits for us all, including what happened to Pakistan, increasing tariffs when government insanely just increased tariffs for the 1 kilowatts of electricity. So Pakistanians borrowed some money, which they did not have, and invested in renewables. It's unfortunately not possible in Ukraine right now because the government keep prices relatively cheap to avoid actually societal disappointment and collapse. But still, this how you deal with the tariffs remains one of the key economical issues to expand renewables.
Thank you, Svitlana. Lisa, would you like to add or maybe touch base on the second question?
Yeah, just on that Ukraine-related question, I think the one other thing is that what's happened in Ukraine now and the progress on renewables has also, again, shown how much more resilient a decentralized renewables grid can be in a war economy, right? So that's not necessarily relevant for all countries at this point, but I think it's an important energy security consideration. On the nuclear question and the UK and the US, I would probably look at this in the context of the UK's overall positioning vis-a-vis the US, where they're trying to position themselves somewhere halfway between the EU and being super friends with the US. So they're trying to find ways of establishing a decent working relationship with the US. And I think nuclear is for them one of the topics where they thought they can find common ground. The US has enormous export interests. So this is to the other question on who else exports uranium. When it comes to nuclear, it's got uranium export interests, but also technology interests. But to flag, I mean, this is not necessarily a great strategy. Nuclear isn't a great strategy. There was a report out, I think, today or yesterday, the World Nuclear Status, Industry Status Update. From among the current projects underway, 44 out of 45 are built by either Chinese or Russian-controlled firms. So this is by no means a technology where Europe or the UK has still a significant advantage or market dominance. And renewables are undercutting renewables everywhere. So it is a subsidy business, right? So yeah, That's to that question.
Thank you. And I'll then move to the next questions. I think linked to what, Lisa, you mentioned about uranium, there's a question from Patrick saying, for nuclear power, does Russia export uranium? And if so, has the EU stopped importing Russian uranium? Does Europe have friendly countries for reliable supplies of uranium? And then the second question is from Kara. Creating a flexible, interconnected, and clean energy system appears as the most rational and ethical choice for countries to adopt through a gradual process of energy transition supported by international cooperation. And this requires responsible long-term choices for governments. Domestic policy across Europe is more and more dominated by short-term policy decisions aimed at winning election driven by populist pressures. In addition, energy transition might change the nature of labor, and could, if not addressed by government, destabilize social cohesion at the domestic level. So question is, how do we reconcile the geopolitical dimension with the domestic one? Who would like to go first?
I can have a go, and maybe Svitlana, you can also add, especially on the uranium question. But yeah, uranium export is fairly concentrated. I think it's Russia, it's the US, it's Canada, it's Niger, Kazakhstan. I'm not fully up to date on which relationships are built up by the EU. That's not my area of expertise specifically. I do think the EU has some relationships with those countries. None of those are necessarily very stable or, you know, much more democratic than the other ones we've talked about. So there is a very limited supply of friendly countries, I think very much limited to Canada. On the question by Karoy, and there was an element on, has the EU stopped importing Russian uranium? Svitlana, you might know better, but I think there's just a proposal out, but it hasn't stopped doing it. So this is one of those things going through the legislative process right now.
Yeah, just I can slightly add to that one. Yes, that's been a long-term advocated for both Europe, but also the US, because Russian uranium goes both ways. And it's not yet been stopped because Russia has a priority on that market too. The countries are quite dependent, especially a few countries in Europe that are still still run large nuclear power stations. But this demand, that's why it was so difficult for the EU and also the US to ban uranium imports, because that's very much needed on the market. And as politicians used to explain it, so that's the highly demand. It's a highly demand product, and we need it, as including as the same with the palladium and other energy transition metals as well. Russia has domination in that areas of market, so that's why it's very difficult to get them caught by the governments. And this demand will only exacerbate, unfortunately, as we've seen the pro-nuclear policies are taking rise across Europe, especially originated from France, who historically uses a lot of nuclear energy to power the industry and the businesses. And this will only exacerbate with the AI technologies and the data storages and all kind of tech development. And Europe, unfortunately, don't have a leading role in the tech itself, and it has to take over those energy production for these data centers, which is not a good thing. It's not a good news for climate as well.
And perhaps on the question from Karoy, I mean, structural change is never easy, and not easy in democratic systems where there's elections every 5 years, where you always have that sort of short-term focus. Obviously, geopolitics are particularly volatile, but I would really argue that overall, especially for UK and the EU, in some ways, geopolitics is still a driver for better energy transition policies because of the energy security alignment, to some extent the industrial market alignment. I think actually the bigger obstacle, especially in the UK, is the fear of reform. and the far right, and that's sort of they obviously have picked net zero as their sort of one of their frames they're working with, even though if you really ask people, do they want cheaper energy bills? Do they want cleaner energy? They say yes, right? Then hardly anyone is actually anti the tech and the solutions that are behind net zero, but there's a sort of narrative and media frame that has been built up. And when you look at what the UK government is doing, I mean, they're still doing quite a lot of good things, but they're sort of very much worried about reform coming in and the fight they're fighting. So I feel like the issue is almost more domestic than the geopolitics at the moment.
Thank you.
Obviously, they're not completely unrelated because these movements inspire each other across borders as well. So that's the other dimension.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you for that. And I think we have time for just a few more questions. So there are 2 questions from Paul. I'll try to sort of like summarize. And then I have also actually a question I want to raise. So first question from Paul is, are the EU, UK and other democracies missing an opportunity to strengthen political relationship with the global south, but not boosting investment enough in renewable in these countries? And the second question was more about how important are Ukraine's strikes on Russian fossil fuel industry to undermining Russia's ability to continue the war. You mentioned about the attacks on the pipeline, taking gas to Hungary and Slovakia, and the LNG terminal on the Baltic coast. And linking it to from a more kind of like European perspective, I wanted to add a question about, well, today during his address to the United Nations General Assembly, President Trump criticized European nations for continuing to buy Russian oil and gas amid the war on Ukraine and call on them to cease all energy purchases. So given the link Trump drew between energy sourcing and national strategic security, how might countries like Ukraine leverage security concerns to accelerate renewable energy deployment? What are, according to you, the risk if energy security becomes a cover for subsidizing fossil fuel dependency under the guise of sovereignty? And on that point, how can Europe craft more of a cohesive strategy, balancing national politics with collective climate and security goals?
I'll try and answer maybe the first and the third one. On Paul's question, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think for years there would have been an opportunity to build much more investment in a more diverse set of global South countries in terms of renewable energy technologies, energy efficiency, cooling efficiency, another big topic. Climate change is adding pressure on cooling demand, which in turn, if you haven't built out renewables, drives gas demand, right? Absolutely, and I think that would also be a geopolitical offer. Now it has been complicated because of this rise of the defense agenda. We've seen cut budgets. Countries have less scope in the EU and the UK in terms of actually doing this investment. I do also think it is a tiny bit more nuanced that I think we've also worked with global South countries. There is also a domestic political economy to them having renewables, which often takes power away from the centralized state, right? And that also for them and for the ruling politicians is often an issue rather than an opportunity. So there's also mixed politics here. But I do think actually that's changing, and the overriding energy security benefit from going renewables is gaining much more traction and impact. And maybe that leads me to your question, Camilla, on reconciling the domestic with the international. I think there's still a lot to work through, but I think the energy security benefits of the transition are becoming clearer and clearer, and of having a more decentralized system. There is a lot of stuff that needs to happen. Our system operators need to get better at adapting to that reality. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Our national security institutions need to be upskilled on what the energy transition means for them, what that means for protecting infrastructure differently, what that means for cooperating, in particular also on cybersecurity, because the digitalization of the energy system will play a role. But I think all all in all, there is going to be greater alignment between those agendas. But yes, Svitlana, over to you for more comments.
Thank you. I can reply in remaining time we have left. So I can reply on oil refineries attacks led by Ukrainian military forces. Currently, for now, they just shut down almost 20 Russian main ports and oil refineries, which is huge, and there was an immediate budget deficit amounted to 20% overall through the year, through the 2020-25, and actually two main ports of Russia, Ust-Luga and Primorsk, which are the key logistical ports for the oil refined products and the condensate and for the crude oil, have been effectively stopped, which means that the price went up a bit, but not for Russia. For Russia, they were forced to sell oil with discounts, and the internal price of gasoline went significantly up, and there are large queues and deficit of gasoline and petrol inside of Russia, so they can't even stop sale. Of course, this has been quite effective, especially with the need to repair those refineries, and mostly the equipment for repairing and technologies are being exported by the Western countries, which are now banned. And this export has been now mainly banned across the different jurisdictions. So it is an effective way to cut immediate Russian oil profits, but it just still the gas is still flowing. And regarding the Druzhba pipeline and Slovakia and Hungary, I can just quickly reply to that the President Trump didn't call on those countries directly, but the Minister of Energy of the US did. But I don't think this will have significant effect on Hungary and Slovakia, because they did nothing to diversify the supply or just reduce the dependency on Russian oil in 3.5 years since the start of the full-scale invasion. And we highly doubt they will do this overnight, just after receiving some governmental warnings. But the most effective thing is actually to close the tap always. But there are long-term contracts, so it's not clear if it will be done in the longer perspective.
Thank you, Svitlana. I think that's a great point to close on. I think you beautifully highlighted also the complex interplay really of energy, democracy, geopolitics, and it really ties together the need of energy transition, let's say security, democracy, but also highlighting the opportunities for collaboration and innovation ahead. And I think it has shown both the complexity of this issue and the ways in which informed discussion and collective action can really make a real difference. And on that note, I think we're coming to the end of our session. So on behalf of Cambridge for Europe, I really like to thank our speakers, Lisa Fischer and Svitlana Romanko, for their clarity and insights. And I hope to maybe see you in person in Cambridge, hopefully soon. And finally, a special thank you to Germana, who helped shape this event and connected me with our speakers. So thank you, Germana. And also to Paul, whose leadership really has made this event possible. Paul, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the speakers. That was very interesting. But I do have one more question for the speakers, and it's very, very quick. So my question is, if we're a campaign group, we contact politicians quite often. If we were to contact with politicians, what would be your main ask? I think maybe one each. To just, if you're going to send an email to our MP today, what should we ask them to do?
I suppose it's doubling down on the energy transition to get more energy security and more agency globally. I think for the UK, that's critical.
Yeah, and not echoing what Lisa said, though I fully agree with you, Lisa, on that. I would just add sanctioned CPIC, which is not paying taxes to the UK government and that doesn't directly benefit anything in the UK, just runs the harmful LNG Russia's business and pay taxes to Russia instead. So, and CPIC is the Scottish registered branch of the US global company CPIC. This would be really effective in helping Europe to cut the dependency on Russian gas. Thank you.
No, good, great suggestion. That actually I have read about CPIC. Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much. I think thank you for our speakers, to Svitlana and to Lisa and to Camilla for being such a great host for this discussion. And thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you at another event very soon. Thank you.
Thank you
a real
so
pleasure.
much. Yes, have a good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.